I will teach you something very important which you can use to start winning more chess games. And I will demonstrate this and teach you this by playing a game against a 2300 rated. So what I will teach you is something that you can use with white and with black, and you can also use it no matter what opening you play. So first things first, I will teach you something that you can use in the middle game. So we need to get through the opening safely. So for the opening, I always recommend to keep things simple. My opponent puts a pawn in the center, I do the same. They attack with a knight, I protect with a knight. Okay. And what my opponent is playing here is the Italian game, which is a bit of a beginner opening, where oftentimes white is just trying to go for that fork. That's at least what most players try to do when they play this opening. And right now they cannot really play it because the queen is protecting it. But what I always like to do here is I like to play bishop e7. Very boring, but also very safe. We are guarding that square, so we can develop the knight. And then on the next move, we can castle. And many beginners here, they actually play the knight there, trying to go for the fork. Then you castle. And sometimes what they do is they just sacrifice the knight for the pawn, so they can take your rook with a bishop. And they think, oh, I achieved something here. I got a rook and a pawn in exchange for a knight and a bishop. But like a knight and a bishop, that's two pieces. You got only one piece and a pawn. Yeah, it's not really good for white. And black will win from here. And the king is not even unsafe because the queen cannot even deliver a check. Just to show you that. It's of course not going to happen here. I'm playing against a 2300 rated. Okay, they played d3, and I'm just going to play d6 to strengthen my center a little bit as well. So the strategy that I will teach you is actually quite simple. Once you see it, you will always see this in your games. We need to do a couple of things. First of all, the biggest priority that we have with every single move is that we double check that our move is not a blunder, because we don't want to blunder material. We want to play boring chess. We want to play safe and solid. We don't want to blunder. We want our opponent to be the first to make a mistake. Okay, so that's something we just always need to keep in mind. Plus, whenever the opponent made a move, before we think about anything, we need to sit on our hands. We need to look at their piece and double check, like, what is it doing? Okay, it's attacking a pawn, but that's protected. We don't have anything to worry about. Okay, and now it's our turn. How do we find good moves? Well, right now we have a problem. The problem is that this position is almost completely symmetrical. And I'm going to show you what I mean with that. I am marking all the squares where we both have a piece and where we are basically copying each other's structure. And as you can see, a lot of these squares are blue. Yeah, that's it. Because our positions are very identical to each other. The only differences that we have is the bishops. And the difference with the bishops is this bishop is outside of the pawn chain, or bishop is inside of the pawn chain. We are still stuck. They have been freed before they push the pawn. We still have to develop this one, and they put their bishop on e3. And what we want to do in the beginning of the game is we want to try to find a way to break the symmetry. We want to create a difference in the position. That is the first part of the strategy. So I'm trying to do something that my opponent cannot really copy. So I have a couple of ideas, but the most useful one is going to be knight to a5. And knight to a5 is a good move because we attack the bishop. And our opponent cannot do that. They cannot play like knight to a4 and attack our bishop because the bishop is not there. So that's the first difference here in the position. They play pawn to b3, which means that we can actually just capture that bishop, and they will have to capture with a pawn. And I'm already so incredibly happy with just, for example, this position. There are many other things that could have happened, but this is already a good start. Why? Well, we do have some differences. First of all, the opponent has doubled pawns. I'm not saying it's a weakness, but it's a difference. They have doubled pawns. Then we have two bishops and a knight. They have two knights and a bishop. That's a difference. And the player with the two bishops will usually have a better game as long as we can try to open up the position. And with opening up the position, I mostly mean trying to remove pawns. So I think these pawns especially, like if we could remove these 4 pawns, maybe even those, then the bishops will become incredibly strong because they will have huge diagonals that they can use to attack. Right now, the bishops are pretty limited and pretty, yeah, just limited in what they can do basically in their mobility. Like this bishop doesn't have squares, and yeah, this one is always looking at some pawns if we move it. Okay. So that's the first thing that we managed to do. We managed to create a difference in the position, and that is important. Once we have a difference in the position, we need to try to understand what does this difference mean and how can we try to use this to our advantage. Okay. And we have two things here. The first thing that I will mention, because I don't want to make things too complicated, is just the bishops. So what we want to do is we want to open up the center. So I am going to play the move c6, because I'm looking at the move d5. And all we want to do is we want to remove pawns from the center, and we also want to, if we can, remove pawns if there are pawns here. So every pawn that's in this square, especially the small red square, but also the bigger blue square, we want to remove those pawns. So I'm going to play d5. And d5 might look a little bit strange, because you might think, wait a minute, you are dropping a pawn there on e5. Yes, I am, but I also have a fork. I have a fork. I attack two pieces at the same time, and they will lose a piece. And basically, they gained 2 pawns in exchange for 1 piece. But here they would actually even be in bigger trouble, because they would have 2 hanging knights at the same time. So my opponent cannot really do anything about that free pawn. They cannot take it. So I'm going to capture here. And what I'm hoping for, I'm happy. What I'm hoping for is this. I'm hoping for more trades, and we play queen to d5. And this is literally perfect. This is perfect because look how many pawns that we were able to remove from the center of the board, which really increased the power of our bishops. So that was the first part of our strategy. The second thing that I will talk about, again, we just need to look at what is the difference in the position. And there is actually a huge difference here in the pawn structure. There is a huge difference in the pawn structure. So my opponent has 3 pawn islands. What does that mean? These 3 pawns are connected. These 2 pawns are connected. And this pawn is all by itself. So they have 3 pawn islands, a red one, the blue one, and the orange one. While as black, we don't have 3 pawn islands. We have this, and technically this is also working together because I can connect them. And I also have this. So we have 2 pawn islands, they have 3. That means that if we get into an endgame, black will always have better chances, because more pawn islands means more weaknesses, especially the orange one for white. That orange one, that's potentially a problem. So what I'm going to do here is an interesting move, pawn to f6. And I play pawn to f6, first of all, because it connects these pawns. Now we really have a solid pawn island. Otherwise, this one was like a little bit by itself still. And also, I am restricting their pieces. The knight doesn't really have that many good squares. Very important, of course, we move an f-pawn, which means we open up a diagonal towards the king. So we needed to double check if there was no light squared bishop there for them. Because if they had a light squared bishop there, that wouldn't be good. We would be dropping a queen. But I already knew that we won the light squared bishop right in the beginning, or at least we traded it for that knight. And my opponent plays c4, which is actually not such a good move. We can just move the queen, pretty much. We can just move the queen. And we don't really have any troubles. And the problem here for white is that they created more weaknesses. So first of all, the pawn island story is still there. But this is already more weak than it was before, because this is now a backwards pawn. It's a pawn that is no longer protected by any other pawns. And we can just start piling up some pressure. Oops, not like that, like this. Yes, piling up some pressure against that pawn, and they will need to use pieces to protect it. My opponent is trying to solve it by just pushing it and trying to trade it away. So we need to think here. Is trading these pawns good for us? Is trading these pawns good for us? That's what we need to think about. And we have 2 things that we can do. We can take that pawn, or we can take this one with the queen. Okay. What would be good for us? Well, it's pretty easy. We have the two bishops, so one of our priorities was to trade as many pawns and the red square, if you remember. Here. That's very important. And the blue square was a little bit less important, so the red square was the actual important one. So that trade is actually not bad for us. It opens up the position for the bishops. We could also take on c4, but imagine that they take here. And imagine that we just simply take back. Well, the first thing is, look at the pawn islands. Our opponent has two pawn islands, red and blue. We have red and blue and orange, meaning we have three. We have a weakness, and it's even a weakness that they can take. So that wouldn't be good. So you can just see by understanding the pieces and understanding the pawn islands, we can find the good move. The good move is this. The good move is to capture. They take back, and now maybe we can take that pawn. And the answer is yes, we can take that pawn. And just by playing this, we are up a pawn. We are already up a pawn. And the reason why was just because we understood the position better than our opponent. We understood that we had to open up things for the bishops. And we also understood that we had the better pawn structure. And do you remember that I talked about weak pawns that we might be able to grab for free in the future? Well, look, it feels like the time has arrived. We got another free pawn. And just like that, we won two free pawns. Not because my opponent gave them away for free, but because we understood the position better. And even if they played slightly better moves, eventually they were going to collapse anyways. Okay, so they moved the bishop here. Very important. We need to double check. Is this doing something? I don't really see a problem there. Okay. And look how little pawns there are left. The position is extremely open, meaning that, yes, we now have killer bishops. We just need to get the bishops into the game. So I'm just going to play, for example, this move. I think this is an interesting move. Bishop b4, because of course, well, first of all, we have to move the bishop, yes, because they did two things. They moved the bishop, but they also opened up a rook. So I pretty much have to move the bishop, but I can move the bishop here. I'm going to attack that rook, and they have to move it. That's fine. They attack my queen. I have to move my queen. And in general, my advice is you should try to get your queen somewhere on a file where there is no rook. For example, here, this file has no rook. So that is the file we need. You could also put your queen behind a pawn. That's usually also smart because then it cannot easily be attacked. So our opponent here is proposing a trade. They are proposing a trade of queens. The question is, should we take it? Well, if we look at the material, we are up 2 pawns. So if we just take it and we go for the trade, that's quite good. Because if we are up material, every single trade that we play is going to get us closer and closer into the endgame. And it's just going to be an endgame that we will win. We do need to watch out. Our bishop is still under attack. So I'm just going to move it to a different square. This is actually a very interesting moment. My opponent played knight to e3. The question is, should we take that knight? Should we take that knight? Okay. In general, the answer would be no, because our advantage is the bishops, and the position is open. But what happens if we take the knight? If we take the knight, that's one more trade. We have 2 extra pawns, but we also have this. Opposite color bishops, meaning they have a dark bishop, they have a light squared bishop. And those endgames are extremely drawish. Sometimes a draw is likely. So I think taking there, you could do it, but you will make your endgame more difficult. What I'm looking at instead is maybe I can get this bishop in the game. So if I can get this bishop in the game, then I can get my rooks into the game because I haven't really used my rooks. Is this trade good for us? Well, clearly yes, because it's just an equal trade. It's a dark bishop for a dark bishop. And also, we are removing pieces in a position where we are already up material. I don't really like that they are attacking my bishop, so I'm just going to move it to f7. And I think that is a very good square because it's also protected twice by the king and also by the rook. They attack this. And now we just have to follow the simplest endgame strategy in existence. Pawn pushing. We have 2 extra pawns. Let's just push them. And as long as we keep pushing them, we are going to win the game. So they play rook here. They attack the pawn. So I think I'm going to play a6 so I can protect the pawn. All right. This is actually such a funny move. There's knight to f5. It's tempting for me to play this. It's tempting for me to play bishop e6, but we have to have a look at it because I think it's also dangerous. Bishop e6. The reason I want this move is because I attack the knight and the rook at the same time. And they are going to lose material. But they have the move rook g7. Check. I move the king. But the knight is hanging. The rook is hanging. If they move the rook, let's move it here, they lose the knight. If they move the knight, they might lose the rook. But if they move the knight here, I take the rook, they take the bishop, I go here, they take the rook, I take the knight. It's pretty confusing, and we lost the pawn, but we still have the endgame with the 2 connected passed pawns. So I actually think that bishop e6 could be winning, but you remember what I said in the beginning? We only want to play moves that we are sure we can win. Did you see how much moves we have to look at? What is the probability, the likelihood that we made a calculation mistake? There is a likelihood, so I won't risk it. I will follow the simplest endgame strategy in existence, which is to think about pushing the pawns. So rook b8 is something I am looking at, rook b8, because then we can connect the pawns. Also maybe a5 works, and a5 looks strange, like why are you playing this? You are giving away a pawn. But there is actually a rule that I always use in endgames, which is that pushing pawns is almost always the best strategy, even if you lose something, because every single time your pawns get closer to the edge of the board, you are getting closer to a win. So I think we can just start pushing some pawns there. Okay, they give a check. King f8. We can just go there and attack the knight. Not really worried. Okay, knight here, and I think we have the move rook to c8. That's going to be a forced trade of rooks. We might potentially lose this, but I actually don't care at all because, as I just said, like literally 5 seconds ago, we can lose a pawn as long as we can trade and get into the endgame. Because now we have this move. We have rook to b8, and this guarantees us a final trade. And now we are just simply winning. We are just simply winning because we have an extra pawn and we can push the pawn, and it's knight versus bishop. It's not opposite colored bishops, so we can just win it. All I need to do is every single move I need to think about advancing the pawn, and they need to every single move try to make it impossible, which white is doing a good job there by making it impossible. But I'm just going to get my king into the game, run up with my king, attack the knight. The knight will have to let go of the square, and the moment that the knight lets go of the square, we will be able to push, and make ourselves a queen. So pretty much they have to sacrifice the knight. And if you look at this position and you feel that in any way you might mess this up or you think this is complicated, then there is really something that you need to learn about this. Because when you have an extra piece, literally every single move or nearly every single move that you make wins the game. All we need to do is we need to get the king closer to the pawns. And then we need to try to create some type of zugzwang situation, which means that we want to try and, let's move this first, we need to try to create a situation in which my opponent just doesn't really have any moves. For example, this is a good move, because, well, they barely have any moves. They pretty much had to move the king there, because if they move the pawn, they lose the pawn. Well, they lose the pawn, they can try to win it, okay? And I'll get my king involved. All right. Very important here. We don't want to trade the final pawn. We don't want to trade the final pawn because if we trade the final pawn, we will not have a checkmate with the bishop. Also important, I already calculated this before going for this. We have a light promotion square for a rook pawn. That is important. If that was a dark square, yeah, we ain't winning that game because we can never promote. The king will just sit in the corner. So if you want to avoid it, you can also do different pawn trades basically there. so you don't end up with a rook pawn. I realized doesn't matter because I just have a light promotion square. And this is what I meant. I'm trying to create this situation where my opponent's king has to defend and I can attack and I can play something like this, and I'm forcing them to make a move, and every move they make lets go of the pawn, which means I can win the pawn, and it's this pawn that's going to win us the game. You can just push, and we are running to the corner. Their best strategy is to try to get into the corner, because if they can get into the corner, they can usually try to make it a little bit more complicated. We have to watch out for stalemate, but I don't think there's a stalemate here. And you can see like the light squared bishop is controlling that promotion square, which of course means that we will be able to promote to a queen. And from here, this should be an incredibly easy checkmate. So